Hello, and welcome to a new edition of Need to Know, a series of video interviews with companies who are shaping, creating, and innovating in the games industry today, and whose work will have a huge impact going forwards into the future. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Tol Poya-Sleeman of Founders Law, here to talk to us today about innovations in AI and the future of games development through the lens of copyright and intellectual property law. Tol, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for coming on board today.
Delighted to be here.
Fantastic. Before we get going, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about your background and what it is that you do at
Yes,
Founders?
sure. So you've mentioned Founders Law. As the name suggests, we specialize in helping early stage businesses, startups, and scale ups. Part of the way we do that is by being a remote first law firm. So we don't have 3 floors on a skyscraper in the city. So we're quite low overheads, and that means we're about usually a third to a fifth of the cost of going to a big city law firm. And that makes good legal advice accessible to companies that might otherwise think it's beyond their reach at this stage of their growth. My specialisms are technology law, online digital, data protection, and kind of creative asset IP. And I kind of work in the overlap of those, which means I head up the firm's practice areas, particularly in video games and AI. So that's why I thought I'd be a good way to discuss those things going forward. I am a gamer myself. I've been playing video games since the mid 1980s. My first games came on audio cassette, so that probably dates me quite well. I don't have the same amount of time to dedicate to gaming that I used to, but I do still keep up with it because I love it, not just because it's my job.
Wonderful. No, that's really, really good to hear. I don't think I've come across games on cassette. That's a new one on me, and I'm
Bit
not
era,
that
yeah.
I'm not too old myself. So yeah, fantastic. Well, it'd be really interesting to hear from your perspective then what you feel some of the sort of bigger opportunities around AI are, and what those opportunities are in terms of for the games industry itself.
Sure. I mean, I'm going to talk widely about AI and machine learning, and those two terms are not quite interchangeable. But if we just expand the conversation to look at in the round, the first thing I would say is the DL in DLSS is deep learning. So big companies are finding ways to use machine learning technologies to generate more horsepower out of existing hardware. So it's just getting more performance out of people's existing rigs. And obviously, there's a PlayStation version, there's an AMD version. So in the background, and particularly as things become more cloud-based, things like latency reduction and just performance enhancement will mean more people can play more games. So it's that kind of level of infrastructure. I think there's some really interesting things going on around accessibility and giving gamers who perhaps couldn't use a traditional controller or are partially sighted ways to interact with games, either through text-to-speech interfaces or very clever webcams with an AI monitoring to give more people ways to play games that otherwise, if they would just look at the traditional ways of accessing, they wouldn't be able to do. Another way gaming is getting into the hands of more people is just in localization. Lots of games are very language dependent, and translation is expensive and time consuming. And a first pass that is kind of machine translated and then refined by human translators is much quicker. So it just means your game can be playable by more people who otherwise might not be able to access it. I was a mentor last year in one of the game changer cohorts of underrepresented video game founder businesses, and particularly with pre-revenue businesses. If you're pitching a game that hasn't got any money yet, so it hasn't got any money to spend on assets, if you've got a pitch deck for a publisher or for access to capital, AI placeholder art, can capture the imagination, and even if it's never going to be a part of the final product, it can help you with raising the funds that mean you can then hire human artists in time. Um, the biggest piece of regulation on AI in the world at the minute is the EU AI Act, and that divides AI use cases into 4 categories. That's kind of prohibited, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. And one of the 2 examples it gives of minimal risk is AI-enabled video games. So I think AI is interaction with digital and digital spaces, and that's what video games are. So I think it will be more of a sandbox, and we'll get to see more development and interesting playing with AI because the world doesn't really think it needs much in the way of control at the minute. Whether or not that changes, we will see. But if you're then dealing with AI as a feature of a game, and I don't know if you played Left 4 Dead, the kind of zombie horde shooter back in the day, but that had a game director, which was an algorithm whose job was to control the pacing and decide when to rush you with a horde, when to attack you with a specialist zombie, when the players were separated, and I think that kind of interactive algorithmic way of controlling game interfaces is there. We'd all like NPCs that don't get stuck on terrain and can do pathfinding, and maybe smart AI can help us with that. I'm a PC gamer primarily, so the first 45 minutes of any game is just setting up the settings so I can get the frame rate I want with the draw distance and so on. And I think the opportunity for, if a console gamer, it's just performance mode or quality mode, but to be able to say to my PC, look, I really want 60 frames a second. I want long draw distances. I'm not too worried about particle effects or foliage. Give me a set of settings that just work. I mean, that would free up so much more of my time. So these kind of smart tools that let us interact with these things in this way. But also, I think tools that help particularly smaller devs, solo devs get quality games into the hands of more people on a wider hardware base. I think those are the opportunities that AI and machine learning technologies will make available to us.
Absolutely. I mean, you're hinting at well, elements of growth here in terms of the games companies themselves. I mean, sustainable growth is obviously super important within any industry, especially the games industry. As a studio scales and gains traction, what would you see as the sort of legal pitfalls relating to AI that they should be addressing, or yeah, considering early to avoid sort of later costs, I suppose.
Sure. I mean, I would generally put those legal pitfalls into four kind of broad buckets. The first one is pure AI regulation. If you're deploying AI onto the EU marketplace, for example, you'll need to be aware of the AI Act. But that video gaming is probably one of the examples, as we've said, which is least impacted. The remainder is not specific to gaming, but the core concepts are around confidentiality and protecting sensitive information, making automated decisions about people, and issues around intellectual property. If you're placing commercially sensitive or confidential information into an AI system, it may be less secure inherently than more traditional forms of data storage that we're aware of. The AIs are sometimes described as a black box. They are complicated. We don't quite know how they work. If they were simple enough that we understood them, they probably wouldn't be as helpful as they are. So there are questions around whether or not there are proper safeguards around putting commercially sensitive information into them and whether or not that is then secure. Automated decision making, it sounds a little bit esoteric, but for example, any business that's scaling is probably hiring, and things like using machine learning and AIs to sort through the dozens of CVs you get, that sort of, you get to proceed in the job, you do not. That sort of decision making about someone which has quite significant effects on their life immediately engages with GDPR, and you want to be very careful that you're not using automated decision making without a right of human review and a level of compliance there. And we might sort of touch on IP on its own characteristics, but IP and AI, and whether or not an AI has been trained on infringing IP, whether or not AI created IP can be protected. There's a whole lot of concerns there, which are probably worth kind of digging into in and of themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, it'd be interesting as well to. I mean, those are sort of those risks themselves. It would be interesting to see your thoughts on sort of the reputational risks specifically to companies.
Yes.
What? Yeah. Sorry. Go on.
Sure. No, I mean, I was looking at some of the statistics on this recently, and there is mistrust of AI. And interestingly, it skews quite young, older people in the gaming industry, and in kind of finance and marketing roles are more likely to want to play with AI tools, but younger, or more creative and development oriented professionals are more likely to mistrust us. I just don't want to get involved with this. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the definitions of AI is a machine-based system which can do things that previously needed human intelligence. So kind of built into the concept is human minimization or human replacement. So there are concerns that human jobs, particularly creative ones, might cease to be as relevant or become necessary. And that is, particularly for people who are trained in these industries, quite concerning. Uh, in fairness, every time there's been a new technology come in that could affect human jobs, there has been a degree of panic around it. When the camera was invented, people thought, well, we won't need artists anymore because anybody can create an accurate representation of the world around them as a still image. But what we actually ended up with is art flourishing and a whole new art form in photography. Um, uh, some jobs may become more niche. Translation might be one of them. I was in Arizona in November, and some of the cabs out there are fully autonomous, and I would not fancy being a cab driver in Arizona right now because it's a very viable alternative. But other jobs that might come at risk: voice actors, motion capture performers, these people who are creating a digital asset that may well become more mechanized. And there's industrial action in the US from the Screen Actors Guild about exactly this issue. So the first one is, are we going to do living, breathing humans out of a job and end up with creative output which is soulless and just made by the machine. A second one is a lot of the AI foundation models that are coming onto the market and having predominance do appear to have been trained on an awful lot of questionably obtained IP. It looks like Meta might have downloaded the whole of LibGen to train its language models on. Artists are saying that their portfolios have been ingested, and a lot of young creators are saying, "I just don't want to work with IP that has been trained in an infringing manner that's not respectful of the rights of others." And it was quite interesting when DeepSeek came out recently and OpenAI said they've stolen all our IP, and everyone went, "Really? You're going to go down that route?" Um, AI costs a lot of energy and water consumption. So in massive data centers, huge amounts of energy consumption. So there's an environmental risk. In the same way that someone might not want to support an ethical meat industry, we might get people who just don't want to support AI simply because they're concerned about the environmental impact. Um, and we are starting to see an evolution on just AI assets being somehow evil. I noticed that last month Steam changed their kind of AI assets policy in a way that they say will now enable them to sell the vast majority of games that have some AI in them. So I think we are seeing a shift because there is a little bit of an arms race around what's efficient, what's effective, what can be done with smaller teams. But there are already some moves in the industry to create a kind of a no generative AI assets kind of quality stamp in the way you might get free range eggs or something, or organic food, as people will be presenting this as a selling point. You're dealing with real human creatives and something that's been created by someone that you might want to support.
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting sort of, I guess, sort of parallel to some of the trends that are happening. Sort of trends that are being bucked by other trends is really really interesting. So you mentioned from the outset, and especially what we're talking about today in terms of sort of copyright and intellectual property laws. How do these actually apply to AI generated game content? Then how would you
As a
describe it?
general rule, copyright exists in the products of human creativity and intellectual property generally. That's not hard and fast, but it's a great starting point. And there is probably not going to be enough intellectual property creativity in prompt engineering that the prompt is somehow protected and therefore its outputs are protected as well. There are exceptions, and that's kind of on like a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. The UK is one of the few exceptions that does actually recognize that copyright can persist in machine generated creative works. And the copyright it's owned not by the machine, but by the human that can make the arrangements for the machine to create the output. But that does create issues around enforceability of that copyright, because generally you can only pursue copyright infringement in the jurisdiction where the infringement was carried out in a primary fashion. So if you create your software using AI in the UK, and therefore you think it's got copyright because I'm in the UK, but someone's infringing in Singapore and Singapore doesn't recognize that AI content as having copyright, you might not be able to enforce it. So there may be some concerns about uh, if you've got commercially valuable outputs that are generated by AI, can you stop someone from just copying them? And is that important? If you are creating IP subject to a contract, for example, with a publisher, and you're promising them that you're going to deliver them a valid IP that they will own, and your software isn't actually containing that IP, you might put yourself in breach of your publisher agreements immediately. So some thought is required in relation to these. There's an underpinning question. Are the models that were used to generate this content for you, were they trained in an infringing fashion? And does that mean that everything they output could be open to challenge as well? Some jurisdictions have concepts of image rights or celebrity rights. So if you're using AI to mimic someone's artistic style or their performance, then that could cause no end of problems. I don't know if you played Indiana Jones and the Great Crusade, but Troy Baker's performance as Indiana Jones is absolutely astonishing. And Harrison Ford himself has come out and said, look, you don't need AI to steal my soul, his words, when we've got human performers that can do this. But contrast that with someone like James Earl Jones, who's recently passed away, who deliberately did make sure that the Star Wars franchise could continue to use his performance to create AI versions of his voice as Darth Vader because he felt that was important. So it's not a clear cut this way or that way, but there are a lot of issues around intellectual property, and governments and regulators are going to have to make some decisions about how this is going to work and try to come to some sort of a global standard, so you don't end up with kind of forum shopping and everybody makes their AI content in India, for example, because it's got a lax approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't sort of appreciated the sort of different sort of global aspect of this side of things. So from a studio's perspective, then, I mean, how should they approach sort of licensing when using AI generated assets, especially considering this global aspect?
With caution, the first question should be, particularly at the minute while all of these court cases are ongoing against the big AI providers, what happens if there's a successful IP infringement claim against the AI provider? It might be that everything those models have ever produced is considered infringing, and that could cause a real problem if you're getting takedown notices on games that include these assets. Um, I think we will get to the stage where larger content companies who have a huge in-house library of assets may actually want to generate their own models trained on their own assets, so they know that the model only has learned from stuff that it has the rights to learn. And we might then end up with a kind of a two-tier system where big publishers or developers that have a huge library of assets can start playing with these tools and accelerating their output, whereas smaller devs that don't have that big library to train on are kind of locked out of the loop, which could be interesting. And as I've said, if AI assets cannot be protected, if you're using them, is it a problem if everybody else uses them as well, and you just end up with games that are copycatting your assets? Do you need distinctiveness in them? We don't think anybody wants this kind of a grey goo approach to shovelware where everything is just asset swaps with the same AI assets getting overused. And I think that will, when that kind of no generative AI quality stamp comes to mean something, if we just start to see huge volumes of stuff churned out quickly, hoping to make a quick buck.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of thinking about the future, then, I mean, how do you see the landscape sort of changing over the next sort of year or so, I suppose, in relation to sort of all sort of aspects of AI within the games industry? I mean, what should businesses be sort of looking out for, watching out for, sort of prepping for
Hmm.
moving forwards?
I do think the arrival of new technology doesn't necessarily always prompt new ideas. I mean, I'm a big fan of VR, but an awful lot of the VR titles that have come out could be played on a flat screen, and the titles that do something that could not be done any other way are few and far between, and those are the standout ones that are successful. So I think what companies should be watching out for are opportunities to do things that have never been done before and have not been possible, rather than doing things that we already do just a little bit quicker and cheaper. Given that AI is about doing things intelligently in a way that might have required a human. I'm a big tabletop gamer. I love complicated role-playing games, but they need a human to sit there and run the narrative and be the game master or the dungeon master or whatever it is. So I think there's a huge opportunity there for that kind of, and we can now play that sort of a game in a digital space without needing to dedicate a human to every single game instance, because there's a very clever AI that's doing that. We've talked a little bit about accessibility. I think anything that can be done to get games into the hands of people who otherwise couldn't play them is a really powerful use case. More broadly, I think governments and courts and regulators are going to start deciding some of these questions about fair use and what is copyright infringement. I think we will continue to get tools that let people generate audio and imagery and video and even code faster, or at least streamlining their workflow pipelines. And I think ways to leverage that and make your business leaner and more competitive and make your profits wider are always going to be strong to look out for. Um, I think we will still see kind of NPC behavior and kind of procedural generation of challenges and levels. I think we might see AI adjusted adaptive difficulty, or AIs that learn player preferences and create customization and personalization of a game experience in a way that is really suited to the way people look to have fun. In the last few years, we've kind of seen the AAA model and everything gunning for the games as a service, live service revenue stream, running into some problems and causing lots of layoffs and downsizing, particularly at some of the really big players in the industry. So I think there are a lot of games industry professionals who are kind of newly unemployed and will be thinking about maybe a future that's not in AAA, maybe in boutique or a small team or a solo dev, and they will be looking for access to these tools to get minimum viable products or vertical slices or products to market in a way that doesn't rely on the huge publisher or the kind of organization that they might have burned them recently. I think AI is kind of an evolutionary arms race. In fact, the way the models are trained is quite evolutionary, but just digital generations can be done in fractions of a second instead of months or years in terms of a living organism generation. And depending on who you listen to, the world could look very, very different in the next few years, both in the gaming space and outside the gaming space. I am bullish on these things. I would like to see a world where it's all quite positive, and we've not, all the examples kind of behind me of AIs in game tell a bit of a morality tale about what happens when ethical constraints are removed or they go rampantly insane, despite the fact that all they wanted to do is help. I would like to see games that are richer, that enhance human creativity and human enjoyment and center that. What I don't want is kind of something that's got the addictiveness of something like Balatro, but with the perfectly optimized microtransactions and kind of compulsive behavior tweaking models, and just manipulating us into just being sources of revenue. Because that's quite a dark side. So anything but that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's a very very good answer, Tol. I appreciate you giving your projections for all of this. It is fascinating. It's definitely something to consider, and obviously it's at the forefront of an awful lot of people's minds today. Thank you so much, Tol. It's been really really fascinating chatting to you. Really really appreciate you coming along today. And I'll make sure that all of your details are at the bottom of this video for people to get in touch with
Yeah,
you
obviously, we're here
and
to
carry
help
on that
anybody
conversation.
in the gaming space, whether their needs are AI related or not. Thanks so much for having me on.
Fantastic. And thank you as well to our audience who have tuned in to catch this video. There's plenty of other need to know videos out there on our Ukie TV channel on YouTube. Thank you for enjoying this one, and more very soon. Thank you so much.